Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, an intentional space to delve into adoption's complexities together. I'm Beth Syverson. I'm an adoptive mom of a 19-year-old son, Joey, who's trying to find his path while struggling with his recovery from substance use disorder. I'm walking beside him while working on my own personal growth and healing. We are committed to helping anyone touched by adoption, and we want to help the general public understand adoption's complexities better too. Today's guest is Fred Nicora, a Late Discovery Adoptee, or LDA. Fred's memoir is called Forbidden Roots, a Memoir of Late-Discovery Adoption. Because of his life experience, he now speaks out about truth and transparency in adoption. He has 13 years in recovery from substance use disorder. Congratulations on that huge achievement. And he runs a small hobby farm in Southeastern Wisconsin. So welcome to Unraveling Adoption, Fred. Glad you're here.
Thanks, Beth. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, I really just want to elevate adoptee voices for sure. And I haven't really had anyone on that's an LDA, a Late Discovery Adoptee. Can you explain what that means? What is late? Like, how late is late?
As I've looked at it, late really can range the gamut anywhere from late puberty all the way up into the 70s or 80s. Obviously, the later it occurs, it's going to have different ramifications on not only yourself, but other people that are in your lives as well. Mm-hmm. So for myself in particular, I was at a large family gathering of extended family. Both my parents had passed away by the time that gathering occurred in 2000. And while there, I had aunt make a slip of the tongue to my wife at the time that she's known me since the day my parents adopted me. And so when I heard that, when I came back to the table and heard what had been said, I questioned her. And at that point, the cat was out of the bag. And at that gathering, I discovered all roughly 200 to 300 people knew, and I didn't.
And how old were you then?
I was 41 at the time.
41. Your story amazes me because how can so many people keep that a secret for so long? The odds of that, it boggles my mind. Does it boggle your mind too?
Yeah.
And there's so many things that must boggle your mind about this whole thing.
Yes. And even as I go through the book and talk about my journey, because the book covers a period from when I discovered that night, and it carries you through the next 6 years in terms of me not only coming to terms with it emotionally, but also doing the logistical steps of trying to find out where I came from, find out who I was, and then even reassessing and determining what that meant for me to wear the clothes of being adopted. That wasn't part of my identity that I held prior to that discovery. So there was a lot of, I'll say, adjustment on my part that needed to take place. And that adjustment even includes looking at myself and how I fit in society differently from the regard that, quite honestly, I lost some rights that day that I found out I was adopted. I no longer had a legal right to access my own legal birth vital statistics. That was lost to me at that point. So that was even a little bit of a mind bend on it. Yeah. So the secrets I talk about, because I think there were a few slips over the years where people said things, but if you don't know what it means, you don't have the context to put it in.
Yeah.
At the same time, I'll say I'm not so certain at some inner level that I wasn't aware that I was adopted. There may have been clues that may have indicated that at some level, and I'm going to say subconsciously, that there was some awareness that was driving some, not only behaviors, but emotions and a lot of things.
Looking back, when you were a kid, did you feel different? Did you feel like, I don't quite fit in here?
I struggled as a kid. I can look back, and here's a little example of how the mind works and how tricky it can be. Going into first grade, and I remember going into first grade, the first half of first grade, top of the class, very socially active, everything was going great. Suddenly in mid first grade, everything crashed. My grades went down to D's and C's, a few F's every now and then, and they never went up throughout the remainder of my high school period. Story later out came that my aunt believed my mom sometime in first grade may have tried to tell me, but it didn't seem to be going well. So she decided to abort the effort at that time. So I do believe that at some level, I may have had some awareness, and that impacted things. Now, back to your question of, did I think things were amiss? Yeah, there's a lot to be said for not only mirroring features that you see within your family and I'll say all throughout your extended family. Everybody grows up and maybe they've got mom's nose, maybe they've got dad's chin, maybe they've got Aunt Nellie's, earlobes, but I didn't have anything. My parents were of Eastern European descendancy. My father, 100% Romanian, my mother, half Polish, part German. Both were, I'm going to say, shorter and darker, and I was tall, thick, and blonde.
Okay.
So I didn't really look like I fit into either of their families, and it was a bit of a puzzle. My dad did have blue eyes, so in 10th grade biology, when I learned about the genetic patterns, maybe it's still possible,
Yeah.
But I'd say I struggled. Now, not only with the physical aesthetic features, but I'll say the inner psychological workings of how you put thoughts together, what you think, what your interests are, what drives you, what you feel compelled to do. I often just could not see how these people that I was around thought. I didn't understand. And as a kid, your natural tendency is to put it on yourself.
Sure.
So for me, I would wear that and I would think something's broken in me.
Yeah.
But I struggled with identity all the way through my 40s until I found out.
Wow.
I had several career changes. I started out in healthcare administration, then I decided I'd go into business consulting and move out to California. That didn't work. So I decided I'd come back to Milwaukee, get an architectural master's and practice architecture. And that wasn't really working. Moved up to Minneapolis, did architecture, but that really wasn't working. So then changed again. It wasn't until I discovered I was adopted that figured out that was the piece that wasn't fitting. That was the puzzle piece that I couldn't seem to figure out how to fit into my life.
Wow. Now, did you have the language of adoption when you were a kid? Did you know anyone else that was adopted? Was that even on your radar?
Not so much. After I discovered, I believe I recall the conversation that my mom tried to have with me. And at the time, there was a boy in my first grade class. I'm not going to say his name. We'll just call him Ralph for the sake of this discussion. I came home and told my mom that, Ralph is in my class and he's really troubling. He's always speaking out of turn and he's kind of belligerent and he seems not very nice. And I don't really like Ralph. And then I told my mom, but I think he's adopted. And that was what led my mom to go down that path. So possibly disclosing, because I think she responded by saying, well, how would you feel if you were adopted?
Oh.
Remember telling me, I would not like that at all. That was the only thing that I really had. Now, as I grew up, another interesting kind of side tangent, when I was in Minneapolis doing my architectural stint, I had a friend up there who was adopted, Bob, and I mentioned him in the book. Bob sat close to me in our office. And I remember at one point he was trying to find his birth mother. He had a complexity. He lived in Minnesota, raised in Illinois, but he was born and adopted out of Pittsburgh. And so there was a lot of things that he was running into. And I just remember him going through this. And I would periodically ask, hey, how's it going? You make any progress? After I found out and I talked to Bob, because he was like one of the first people I ran to, Bob, what do I do with this? And he said, it's kind of interesting. He goes, I've never had anybody else in my life that has shown as much interest in my adoption as you. Most people, it's just like, oh, that's nice, and get on with it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, most people just have no frame of reference or like, I don't know
No,
what to do with this once I
no,
find.
I was, it was a whole new world.
Wow, I'm glad you had that person. Wow. And what did your relatives have to say? I know your parents were gone at that point, but your extended, all of whom who knew you were adopted, what did they have to say for themselves? Like, did they apologize?
Well,
Or?
it's interesting. If you go back to, I spoke with one of my dad's aunts shortly after I discovered, and she had indicated that it was really my father that was the driver of trying to keep me in the dark. In the 1930s, he was about 3 years old. His parents went through a divorce. He ended up in the county home, which was the orphanage at the time. And so according to my aunt, he didn't want me to face the horrors of being an orphan.
Okay.
That was the theoretical ground of why they chose not to tell me. Whether that's the basis of truth, I have no idea. I can only go with what I've been told. But I think given that was the premise that everybody, all my relatives, moved forward with. So when I discovered, I'd say initially, the vast majority wanted to somehow try and figure out how to shove me back in the closet and pretend the whole thing never happened.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Over time, I would say I didn't quite let that happen.
Good.
Because at that time, and I'll give you a kind of a context to think about it, that night, my entire foundation was swept away. If you think about who you are and what your inner value and core beliefs are about, they tend to be centered around truths that you assume as you're growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly my main reference for obtaining all those truths, my family, suddenly had a big lie in it. And I wasn't sure. It was bigger than the Santa Claus lie, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, much bigger.
You know,
wow.
Yeah. And so from that standpoint, I lost a lot of ability in my own right to trust my own judgment for quite a while.
Wow.
And really understand that my perception of what's happening around me is real. And that took some rebuilding. That took a bit of rebuilding, some counseling and some rebuilding.
Yeah, I bet. You're not anchored anymore in yourself.
No. So from that standpoint, going back to your question, I didn't really push them into it. Sure, there was a bout of anger initially that I felt very betrayed. I was angry at them for it. I was embarrassed because everybody knew more about me than I knew about myself. And as time went on, I found it kind of divided basically into three camps. You know, one camp was, oh, let's not talk about it. Just put it back in the closet and pretend it never happened. Nothing's really changed after all, has it?
Right.
That was one camp. The other camp was, well, you know your parents loved you, and if there's any questions we can help with, we'll help. And I guess we're sorry that we didn't say something earlier. And then the final camp was, how can you desecrate your parents' death like this? Can't you understand that when you were born, your birth parents wanted nothing to do with you, and they want nothing to do with you now? Why are you running around trying to dig up the past?
Oh, that one hurts.
Yeah, so it was all over the board. And over time, eventually, I learned to snip branches from the tree that I would say weren't willing to accept that once I discovered, I had a lot to discover about myself. And that was probably going to change me. And those changes are just me finding out who I really am.
Yeah. And did you go into reunion or search at that point, or?
I did. It was an interesting process. And I'll say the first big hit for me, obviously, was that night when suddenly I discovered people had lied to me. And then I had a kind of, it's more complex than that, but that's how it felt. You know, everybody's told me this false truth about myself. And then the following week, because that was, I believe, on a Saturday or Sunday, the following week on Monday, I called the state to find out, first of all, is it true that I'm actually adopted? I was having a hard time believing just about anything at that point. And they confirmed that. And then as a non-adopted person, it really never struck me that adoptees didn't have rights to their own information. That just wasn't something that was in my wheelhouse. I don't think I even understood what Bob was really going through. I think to me, I thought, oh, they must have just lost his birth certificate and that's what's happening. They're trying to find it again. I didn't understand that. No, he's not allowed to see it, until certain other things occur. So for me, that Monday, talking to the state, I'm going to say there was a lot of education that the state had to provide to me in terms of what my place in society was in reality versus what I thought it was. And that was harsh, and that was a learning experience.
I bet that was really hard.
But eventually I did come to terms with it because I was just trying to find out, where did I come from? Who am I? If I'm not half Romanian, what am I? Because I don't know, And it stunned me that I couldn't find that out. So I did go through the state process. Now, the state of Wisconsin had an interesting process, and I'm going to plug a little legislation here. Currently, we've got it's called SB 15. It's going up before the Senate. It's in the Assembly at this point, looking to open some records in the state of Wisconsin. So if anybody out there is in Wisconsin, please write your reps. Tell them you want to see SB 15 move forward and those records become unsealed.
Wow, that's awesome. Are you behind that bill?
Yes, definitely. I'm not the driver of it. I'm part of a group that's helping to move it along.
That's really great that you're using legislation to overcome the injustices that you've experienced. That's the way to do it. You can't go back and fix whatever already happened, but you can help people moving forward.
Yeah, that's my intent. In your question in regard to reunion, so I did go through the state's reunion process in which I originally filled out a form, paid some money, got the non-identification information, which is the redacted file from the social worker, along with some other pieces of information that allowed me to get the background of the history of the adoption. It didn't tell me anything that would reveal identities, but it did give me some context, which I thought was helpful. It also showed me just how difficult it was for my birth mother at that time, what she went through, which probably was good because it did allow me to be open to a different view. However, then after I read that, then I was to write a letter, hand that over to the state. The state was to read it to my birth mother. If my birth mother agreed to release my identity, I could find out who I was. If not, I had to wait 5 years. I could try again. And if she declined after that 5 years, it was terminal. I wasn't allowed to pursue researching my identity anymore. So that was a shock. That just blew me away, that somebody else technically owned my life at the age of 41. And until they granted permission for me to find out who I was, I had no right to get that.
That blows my mind. The 5 years thing, like what? And especially as a late discovery adoptee, no one's getting any younger here. Your birth, 5 years.
I did reunite with my birth mother then. She granted it on the first letter. Now, she did tell me, she said, if you would have come back when my husband was still alive, I don't know what I would have done because I never told him.
So much shame.
She had told one of her daughters. But, I missed a lot of people. My birth father had passed away in 1993, so I never had a chance to meet him. I did do a lot of research. A lot of the book covers me just really trying to go through and put the pieces of my paternal side together.
Okay.
I found birth mother. Now, the other thing I'll say about birth mother, she was very, very guarded, and she carried a blanket of shame. And it was sad to see. It was hard to watch. What she went through in the 50s was a very shameful process. She went away to a work wage home for 6 months where she was basically a nanny and a housekeeper. She had been teaching. She was 22 at the time, so she was a teacher, 5th grade teacher.
Wow.
So now she's finding herself as a nanny and a housekeeper in a house, gave birth to me and then returned back, told to forget about it and just tell everybody you were in Europe for 6 months and get on with life.
Those birth mothers, especially in that era where they were just told, just go on with your life. Nothing ever happened. La, 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 la. That will fuck somebody up. I'm sorry. That is terrible.
It's sad. Unfortunately, it interfered with our relationship.
I'm sure.
She passed away a few years ago, and even to the grave, if we would meet in a restaurant, I was to go in a back door, sit at a table, and she would come in the front door. She'd find me. She didn't want people to see us walking in together. I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. Just told not to because they were too afraid, somebody's going to figure it out.
Like who on her side didn't know her husband was dead, but like who is she afraid of finding out?
If I had a guess, neighbors, friends in the community, possibly some of her deceased husband's family was there.
That is so sad.
I don't know how far into her family it was known. Obviously her mom or sisters or dad knew, but I don't know much beyond that.
That's so sad for her and just sad for you. You finally get to meet your birth mom and she's ashamed to be with you. I mean, that's just got to rip you apart.
And in all fairness, she was kind to me. She one-on-one, she was very open and very transparent, but she just couldn't get beyond that blanket of shame. She couldn't shed that.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And if you really think about it, the whole process in which we came together just reinforced that shame by the state imposing upon her, hey, the only way he can find you is because if you don't want your secret out of the bag, because we understand, it's a shameful thing you did.
Yes. Oh, the state just perpetuates it.
Yeah, it reinforced the whole thing. So
yeah, that's really, really sad. I really hope that things are much different nowadays, but I think that still there's a lot of laws and cultural mores that are not as bad. I don't know. What do you think? Are things getting better? A lot better? A little better?
It's interesting. I think I taught high school and middle school for about 20 years. And during that time, I just retired early about 9 years ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago. And so I was pretty in tune with the youth. And when I looked at the youth, I would say their interpretation of those situations is much different. There were a lot of girls. I shouldn't say a lot of girls. It was a very small school. I'm in a small town. But, the girls that got pregnant, and maybe the ones that had abortions I just didn't know about. A number of them had them, and they would just refer to the guy as their baby daddy, and the guys would refer to the girl and the kid, that's my baby mama,
Okay.
I'd say their acceptance of the situation has moved forward. So there's some hope that I think society is moving forward. It's interesting, even from 2000 when I discovered till recently when I kind of reemerged into the community, because I did take a break. I am a recovering addict. I went through a period of alcoholism and had treatment for that. So during that period, I kind of removed myself from the adoption community. One thing you'll find if you get involved in the adoptee community, there's a bit of anger there. People are frustrated.
Sure. Justifiably so. I understand.
Yeah. There's reasons they should be, but there's also something called the primal wound that many believe is real and exists. I see how it plays out in my own life. It's interesting. I think it varies in people. Some people have it more severely. Other people have it less severely, probably like PTSD. You can have some people that have strong reactions. You can have others that still are affected, but it's not really interfering with life. So I think my assessment, and I'm not a clinician, so don't take it as expertise, but it kind of varies all over the board.
I think like if two people were in the same car accident, in the same car, they might have completely different ideas of what happened and how bad it was and different recovery experiences. So I think everybody's trauma, everybody handles it differently based on a million different factors, and it's all okay. However people need to handle it, right?
Yeah.
Everybody does it their own way.
And that's where I think the move toward truth and transparency, where it's saying, because what I found is I think I could have fended better on the pulling out of my discovery had I just had access to information and been allowed to reassemble a foundation.
Yeah.
The whole house didn't have to fall down, but since I couldn't put a new foundation down, nothing was really holding it up. And
that's a good point.
It took a long time.
Yeah. So the initial shock was really horrible of finding out you were adopted, but then to come up to one obstacle after another with the state and with your records and with piecing your search together, and just that must have just made it so much worse. I can sort of relate a little bit because I figured out I was a lesbian late in life after I was married to a man. So I lived much of my life as a heterosexual, and then I lost a whole bunch of rights when I became gay. Like, that sucks. That sucks. I finally figured out who I am and coming into my own authentic self. And now I can't get married. Although then we did, but the laws had to change. But it's just like, really? It feels horrible to be demoted like that.
So, and I'll throw this out there. And when I look, because there's a lot of, I'll say, marginalized groups who I suddenly relate to very strongly, because now I get it. I don't think I really got it before. I'm a white male. I didn't really get it before.
You were at the top of the food chain for a while.
It's just a reality. But as I look at it now, I mean, what I find really interesting is I look at all these other marginalized groups, yet at the same time, there are specific laws that specifically state they will be granted the same rights as others. Whether those are enforced or not is one thing. But I'm going to say, as far as I know, adoptees are the only marginalized group where the law specifically states that we will be discriminated upon.
Oh, that's terrible. Like, it literally says that in the law?
Well, it doesn't say they will be discriminated upon, but it does spell out that we have less rights than the rest of the population. I don't have the same rights to my birth vitals or statistics or social history that the rest of the population enjoys.
Yeah, it's really terrible. And you don't really realize it until you need it. You don't realize how important that is to you until someone says, no, you can't have it.
Yeah.
That's just really stink. Yeah. Now, when did you start grabbing alcohol? When in this whole process?
Honestly, when did I start grabbing it? Probably when I was 14.
14. Yeah. I was going to.
However, what I would say is I fell pretty much in the normal drinking patterns that I observed around me through most of my life. I'd say I probably was on the heavier side, but I don't think I had quite crossed the functional line of being an alcoholic. Now, according to the disease continuum, I was an alcoholic and I just was further down along the continuum. However, what I would say is once I discovered I was adopted, I noticed my consumption increased exponentially.
Yeah, I bet.
And that was the period where I think I accelerated to a point of dependency.
Yeah.
And for myself, if you get into the different types, there's maintenance alcoholics who they always have to have a certain amount in their bloodstream.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's binge alcoholics. I was a binge, but my binges were every other day.
Oh,
So
okay.
it was like pretty much every day I'd get blottoed, and then the next day would be recovery.
Oh,
the next
wow.
day would be blotto, and the next day would be recovery. So
Wow. Were you teaching at this point, or?
I was.
Wow. That must have been bad headaches and crabbiness.
Just because you find out that you're adopted doesn't mean you can quit your job.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't pay the bills to find out you're adopted. Okay. Right. Yeah. So you're working through all this, trying to manage your regular life, trying to manage all these new emotions. And alcohol is a great numbing agent. It really, really works well.
And I think that's what I did.
Yeah.
I didn't have any other spiritual tools or very good coping mechanisms in place.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say to anybody out there that is skating through life saying, hey, I don't really need to attend to my spiritual needs. You hit a pretty big roadblock. You may find it a little too late. That's what I believed happened to me is I had let a number of other things kind of slide. And as a result, it was kind of a perfect storm.
So were you kind of skating through life, just like on the surface, partying on the weekends with your alcohol or whatever, and then this big earthquake happened and you didn't have a community or a spiritual practice or a grounding?
Yeah. For me, for instance, I practice faith through a church I attend, and I found it to be kind of like any other physical fitness. The more you work it, the stronger it is. And so whatever church you decide to go to, whatever group you find that helps you invest in tools that will allow you to develop greater faith when things are not looking good, make sure you stay not only physically fit, but spiritually fit as well.
Yeah, it's so important. And our culture doesn't really, unless you're really in a church culture already, our wide culture doesn't really promote or value spirituality or a groundedness or a authenticity. It's very commercial and, I don't know, short term. And it takes a lot of work, and it's harder than just drinking.
It is.
It's a lot harder. I look at my son.
But honestly, I don't miss the drinking.
You don't miss the
I
drinking.
can say that.
But it was effective, right? It was effective at reducing the pain at the moment while you're drinking.
I would say to some extent, yes and no, because I think at the same time, alcohol's also kind of an emotional accelerant.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
So
did you get angry when you drank? Or
I would get angry. I mentioned to you before, I live pretty rural, so I have a barn, and the house I had prior, the basement wasn't connected to the house. Mostly by myself. I didn't exercise it out on other people, but yeah, I did some screaming.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Well, I sometimes look at my son who's just still struggling with substances. His substance is mostly cannabis, which is another good numbing agent, but it just puts him to sleep mostly. Just totally numbs him out, and he doesn't go up, he goes down. But it's hard to find something that will work that well in the moment. I mean, it's not a good solution long term. He's obviously derailed. He's unable to work. He's unable to really function right now, but he's not having to feel the pain. So it's going to be hard for him to develop the skills and the tools to replace that. I'm not hopeless about it. I know he'll figure it out. Somehow he'll find whatever it is that's going to work for him. But it's a hard thing to find something to replace that ease of use.
For myself, I went through, some outpatient counseling. I did the intensive outpatient counseling program. And then I also got very involved in AA. And I did years of AA.
Okay.
I mean, I say years of AA, I mean, we're talking 365 out of 365.
Oh, wow. Every day you went, wow.
I did for quite a while.
That's amazing.
I needed to.
Yeah.
I mean, to some extent, my brain needed a pretty good scrubbing at that point. And it just, what I found with AA is, I don't know how much you know about it as a organization, but it's a 12-step program, and its root actually does come out of a old Christian faith-based program. However, they kind of scrubbed the Jesus and God out of it and gave you a higher power instead. But the principles within it are pretty much the same as what you'd find within any faith-based organization. So for me, at least, I think what it did, going through years of becoming more accustomed to that, and I'm going to dare say to some extent, cleaning my brain out
Quite literally, huh?
from the garbage I had piled in there, opened the door that I could be again receptive to, faith in God and look at, what that meant to me and what that relationship was to me. And I can honestly say, when I look back in my life, I've always had a relationship with God. I don't know if that relationship that I've had has always been matched with what I'm practicing with faith on the outside. And for me now, it's become more of a search to find where can I exercise my personal relationship with God best in what church or organization. Because relationships are important. We as a human species depend on relationships. And so when you look at even alcohol and drug abuse and addiction, it's really a relational disease.
Yes.
It deals with relationships. And that's what you have to kind of sort out.
Yeah.
So it's finding places where you can find healthier relationships that can maybe take the place of the relationships that you need to prune out, because there are probably relationships that need to be pruned out.
Yeah. I think that is quite true in my son's case. And just finding that community where you feel like you belong and that you feel held and also kind of pushed to grow. That's tricky, but you found that in your church, right?
I'm going to say initially it was AA.
Oh, AA
and then
first.
eventually I decided to branch out and see if I could get involved in some kind of a church community again. And I did a lot of church shopping. I visited a number of churches before I settled on the one that I'm currently involved with. So,
and didn't you make a group there for addiction?
So I am a group leader of a men's group, but it's not specific to addiction. But I'm going to say a commonality in many of the guys in my group. We've had a past of straying pretty far off the path.
Okay.
So we're all just trying to figure out how to help each other live a better life.
That's great.
Not necessarily fall in the same holes we fell in before.
Right. And learn from each other and help keep each other up. It's so important. I think it's great for men to get together in their own spaces sometimes. I think that's really really good.
I would agree.
Yeah. And what about LDA or adoptee spaces? Are you in those as well?
I've been, really reemerging. The thing that I found, it's just fascinating. Okay, keep in mind, I found in 2000 I was adopted. So I dove deep into the adoptee community. At that time, there really wasn't the equivalent of the Facebook groups or the chats or podcasts or all that kind of stuff. We were pretty much in the land of chain emails. And there was a chain email group that I joined. It was Late Discovery Adoptees by a guy named Ron Morgan. But, there was probably about at any given time, 30 or 40 of us that were on that board. Then some would drift out, some would drift back. And it was a way to really, for me, it held me together, quite honestly. Nice. If it wouldn't have been for that group, I don't know what would have happened. Good. Because it was the only group I could really relate to. And that's where I started building trust again.
Okay.
As I look at it today, as I've kind of reemerged, the explosion of Facebook groups, of, the podcasts and all the other tools that are happening is awesome, because I do see a lot more discussion being facilitated. Now, I'm going to say too much of the discussion, I think, is stuck kind of in the negative realm, that there's still a lot of anger venting, and I'm going to say for myself, coming out of an addiction cycle, and learning the tools that I need to survive, accepting the fact that I am an addict. I'll be an addict for life. And unless I manage that disease, it's going to take me down. I accept that. I understand it. I see it. And I would say I've been able to, and I try to apply a lot of those tools as they apply to situations as an adoptee. Obviously earlier in this discussion, I revealed my frustrations with state laws. I am trying to work to change those things. But at the end of the day, I still need to find a way for myself not to just let it take me down a negative hole and feel hopelessness and despair, where I do see a lot of the community is still stuck there, I think, to some extent.
A lot of despair.
They struggle to move beyond that. And many of them are not receptive to tools like faith. They're not receptive. If I say, go make a gratitude list, they're going to reach through the phone and punch me in the face, probably,
It's so tricky. There's so much pain. And I've had it heaped on me just because I'm an adoptive parent. So I'm familiar with that defensiveness and just pain. I just see it as just trauma and just raw pain that hasn't been dealt with yet at all, which is understandable because a lot of adoptees landed in not good adoptive families at all. A lot of them went from a birth family got relinquished and then got dumped into a horrible adoption situation. So I don't blame them for being angry, but it can be pretty toxic after at sometimes, and it's just like chasing our tails or something, just like not getting anywhere. But you got to find that off ramp of every single person in whatever part of the adoption constellation you're in. You got to figure out where your healing is, right? You found yours through your church and through AA. And
actually, what I would say is there's two separate things going on. Healing is one thing, and the healing isn't necessarily resolved by faith. What really resolves the healing, I believe, is either whether it's working with a therapist, whether it's working with other adoptees, exposing, putting light on what that trauma and that pain is, and then learning to embrace it and accept it and move forward with it. That's going to be separate than, to me, what that helps with is the healing process. I think that's going to be something that I'm going to be dealing with the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. The faith is something that on a day-to-day basis, when I'm getting overwhelmed, maybe because I haven't fully healed, I've still got things, just the other day, I recognized that I was overreacting to something, and I was struggling to figure out why that was. Why was I experiencing this fear, And what it came down to is I started to tie it back to something that happened when I was a kid. And probably there's a little, I'm going to say a minor ripple of PTSD going on. So until you can really fully heal, I think what the faith does is it allows you to bridge a life and create a life that's maybe more enjoyable than if it weren't in place. Can I take my bad mood because I'm not fully healed yet? And what are the tools I can use to help me bring that mood in a different direction so I'm not miserable?
Yeah. I love that view of faith as a kind of a daily coping tool. Is that what you would say?
Yeah.
Yeah. We all need to find it. Everybody finds something different, but whatever you need to get you through intact.
Yeah.
Through this difficult life, really.
Yeah. And I think too many people, and this is just my sample of one thinking, so I recognize it's not a valid theory, but I think so many mistake that if you find faith, you're substituting it for healing. And to me, they're two separate things. Faith is a tool I use to try and manage my day-to-day living. Healing is a long-term process that it will unfold as it unfolds. I can't just suddenly say, I think I'm going to heal tomorrow and go to a psychologist and, have them help me heal tomorrow. That's not going to happen that way. It's going to be
all done.
an unfolding. Once something unfolds, then all of a sudden maybe that exposes something else. That gives me something new to work on and try and accept and embrace and love about myself.
Like layers of an onion, just peeling back more layers and more layers. In what ways do you feel like your journey as an LDA differs from an adoptee who's known they were adopted since they were a little kid? They don't remember not knowing. What extra layers of your onion do you have because of your late discovery?
One thing that, as I've talked to other LDAs, and I've seen a difference. Okay, most of the LDAs I'm aware of, when they find out, they search. Whether their adoptive parents are alive or not, really I haven't seen that that's had an impact. Whereas the adoptees population as a whole, those that have known from as long as they can remember, often they're just kind of, I think the term is coming out of the fog at different points in their life. Some might at 18 decide they want to search. Some it might not be till they're in their 30s and they start having kids. Then suddenly they decide they want to search. Some, it's not even till their 50s or 60s. Recently, about 9 months ago, I discovered I actually had another half brother I didn't know about.
Oh, wow.
And he popped up, and it turns out he was 7 months older than I was. Through my biological father, he had another kid that was adopted out.
Wow.
But unfortunately, he died before I met him, and he never searched. So it was his daughter that had reached out to me because of our close proximity on the ancestry database, that it didn't make any sense to her, and she was trying to put together where her father came from because she wanted.
Oh, interesting. Because you and her dad were both adopted, so that complicates things greatly. Wow. And a lot of adoptees I know wait until their adoptive parents are gone.
Yeah.
Which might mean also your birth family is gone too.
Yeah,
that's
as long as the unintended consequence. You're trying to be a nice guy, but all of a sudden, then by the time you get around to looking, you find it's not there. So in answer to your question, what do I see as a difference? Typically, the traditional no from day one, they are able to develop the ego that's necessary to kind of shield them from some of the realities of it. And in many cases today, in the adoptions I see that are going on today, and I see from my perspective some very healthy adoptions where they're very open, transparent. There's contact with birth families. Adoptive families aren't, hiding secrets about where dad was, that maybe he's in prison and your mom was she raped? Everything's very open. And I think that's a much healthier environment. So that helps a lot. Earlier, you had asked about some of what I see in society. And it's interesting because when you look at media, there are so many different portrayals of adoptees. Superman was an adoptee. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Luke Skywalker.
You can run down that path, but there's others that are less than desirable, and how they're portrayed. And have you ever watched the series Yellowstone?
No, I haven't. I've heard people talking about that though.
It's hilarious because one of the main characters in it turns out is a late discovery adoptee. He
no kidding.
In the middle, and so for me watching that, it's interesting to see how it all unfolds. And the verdict's still out. I need to see how they resolve it before I give it a stamp of approval or not. But
interesting.
That would be the biggest difference. I didn't, growing up, consciously have to deal with the concept of shame. I hear a lot of other adoptees talk about that. I didn't have to do that. For me, it was the blast. All of a sudden, it hit, and I had a lot to process in a very short amount of time. Unfortunately, other people were in my life at the time too, and it affected them profoundly as well. My now ex-wife, I'd say, did we divorce because I found out I was adopted? Probably not. Would we have ended up divorced? Maybe. Hard to say, but it definitely didn't help.
That was a huge stressor, right?
Yeah, she lost me. I became somebody different. All of a sudden,
I bet.
you're, sleeping next to a person you don't know.
Yeah.
How's that going to work out? My kids were impacted. They lost me for a number of years,
Oh, wow.
Initially, it was just because I became consumed with finding out who I was. It wasn't for me anything controllable. It wasn't like I could just say, do I want to search today? No, it was I needed to find it. I needed to find what I had lost in that one statement that I was adopted.
Yeah.
If that's not my foundation, what is my foundation? Because I need to find it out.
Yeah. I hope people that aren't adopted that listen to this understand that deep, deep desire to find out who you are. I mean, it's no small thing. Your genetics and your history is so important, and we don't really consider it. We're like, oh yeah, of course. But man.
Well, it kind of amazes me, and even when I found out, because it was just starting to bud then, like Ancestry.com. And then that's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and people will invest unrealistically gobs of money they can't afford just to dig deeper and find out. So the fact that it's not recognized that adoptees would have that same want and desire, and I believe that's an innate need to understand where I came from. The human experience just isn't about medical facts, or it isn't about just menial connections. I discovered I had a great-great-grandfather that fought in the Civil War. And actually, my father was raised on the same farm that he returned to after the Civil War. I started thinking about it. My relationship to that great-great-grandfather isn't any different than anybody else's. They were dead long before I was even born, and yours was probably dead long before you were born.
Yeah, sure.
It's still of value to me. I still want to know who that person was and honor what their life was, where they came from.
Yeah, definitely.
I found out I'm mostly Norwegian, English, and Scottish. So if you think about it, my life was, I was kind of like Thor trying to fit into the costume of Dracula.
Yeah.
It just didn't work.
You were raised Eastern European, but you were Western European. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Wow. I think I know what you're going to say, but what advice do you have for adoptive parents?
I'd say there's a couple of things. One, truth and transparency, man. It's the way to go. The more that you can be open and honest, obviously as a parent, your job is to guide the child, and you can't lay too much on them all at once. You got to figure out what's appropriate. Now, the other thing in regard to that, I'd say, if you don't have a counselor that you're seeing, find one. You don't have to see them nonstop every week or anything, but have somebody that's familiar with the story, that occasionally when you run into a bump that you're not sure how to handle, that you have a resource that's well skilled in it, that has expertise in it. As I raised my children, I did periodically go to a counselor just to say, what do I do about this? Because
Yeah.
this alien I have is acting strange and I don't know what to do
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
I didn't want to damage it anymore. So I would say,
Mm-hmm.
find a counselor, make sure you have that in your back pocket. If the child's receptive to it, let the child see a counselor. The other thing I would say about counselors, just because you as an adoptive parent love a counselor doesn't mean the kid's going to love that same counselor.
Mm-hmm.
You can have two separate counselors. Nothing wrong with that. That's actually awesome. I'd say the other thing is be active in who they are as a whole person, not just as an extension of their adoptive family. So if, for instance, my parents, let's say they would have decided to be open with me and maybe they would have helped me celebrate certain Norwegian holidays or, just make that culture that they're actually a root of part of their life and demonstrate to them that you're embracing that culture as well as who they are as a person. I think those things can also very help.
Have you discovered Lefse now that you know you're Norwegian?
Well, I always liked herring, so
Ew.
I don't know about the Lefse though. I haven't gone down that.
I'm sure you can find it over there in Wisconsin. I'm a little bit Norwegian, and my grandma made Lefse. Now my dad makes it. It's a pain in the neck to make, but Lefse and krumkake and kringla and all sorts of white food made out of flour and sugar mostly. Highly recommend it.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is, you really want to kind of convince them that you're on their side. Beth, I'll look at what you're doing here, man. You're awesome. You're trying to build the community. You're helping the adoptee community. The more you can demonstrate that and the more that the child, as they're growing up, can see that you've got a vested interest, that it's not just lip service. Comes a crisis, they're going to believe you're on their side and they're not going to turn against you. Hopefully. That's the goal.
Yeah, hope so. Gosh, that's what I hope for my son for sure, that he knows that I am 100% behind him. And if he wants to go search for his birth family, I am right there. If he doesn't want to, totally fine. If he wants me to help him with his recovery, I'm there. I was not always on board with this stuff. I didn't realize adoption trauma was a thing until he was in crisis at age 15. So I'm trying to make up for lost time a bit, but I'm trying to help other parents figure it out sooner or to find a healthier space for their adopted kids so we can all live into our authentic selves and be as whole as we can possibly be.
That kind of flags a thought for me. One thing I'd like to see, and it's something that I'm going to say I've got a little bit of a mission myself of it. First of all, the adoptee community is exploding because all of a sudden now the NPEs and everybody else that is finding genetic surprises is kind of finding themselves hitting similar laws that we've been battling for a long time. But the more we can get the entire adoption constellation onto the same page and be working to help all of us, I think the sooner we'll see progress move forward, because too many times the arguments of like, well, if we open up records, is it going to hurt the birth moms? And that's turned out to be a very false argument, and it gets interesting today with the DNA databases. Because if you start looking at it, an adoptee can either go and get a birth certificate and see where they come from, which then becomes an issue between two people, the birth mother and themselves, or they can run all over the DNA databases and tell every single relative they run into that they are this bastard child out there trying to find out who their mother is. And eventually it will come out, and it is coming out. And
there's no more secrets.
I think we all can see that the secrecy and shame has to go away.
Definitely.
We have to heal as a big joint community.
Definitely. Is there anything else you would like to say before we wrap up? Anything else I missed or anything you'd like to plug?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground here. And again, I just really appreciate the ability to talk to your audience. Any adoptive parents that are either contemplating going into it or are currently in the adoption situation. I'm going to say I'm a parent of 3 children of my own. Raising kids is hard enough the way it is. And my hat's off to any adoptive parent out there. You are taking on a big challenge. God bless you. You're wonderful people for doing what you're doing. And I, at this point, acknowledge, I'm sad that I was never able to bring resolution with my own adoptive parents. I think I loved them. They loved me, that I know. I would say they made a mistake in not telling me. They followed a vein of thought at the time. But I think we could have moved beyond that. And it's sad that we couldn't. But I think there's a lot of adopted kids that do very well, thrive, and my hat's off to them. They've ended up in good placements. Parents have done a great job. Others, not so much. And regardless of what the parents do, the kid may struggle.
Yeah.
And the fact that you're willing to stand behind them and help them through that is amazing and awesome. So that's off too.
Well, I think it's our duty as adoptive parents to realize as early as possible that there are special, unique needs for our kids that non-adoptive families don't have to deal with, and to educate ourselves, dig in, because it's not just the same. It's not the same. It's no blank slate. No, this is just going to be just the same as your own biological kid. It's very complicated. So adoptive parents, get educated and on board and listen to adoptees like Fred.
If they're doing transracial adoptions as well, those are even more complex.
Even more layers.
I'm going to say, if you don't have a counselor, get a counselor.
Oh, yeah.
And if you can get your kids involved in groups of their race and their culture, do that if you can, because that'll help a lot.
Yeah. Like literally move to a place that has those people prominently in it. Honestly, it's really a very big deal. And it's something that adoptive parents really, really need to be aware of and awake to. So, well, thank you, Fred, for sharing your story. I think your story is just fascinating. And I'm really proud of you for being in recovery and for sharing your story and writing this book and helping other LDAs and other adoptees and adoptive families. So thank you so much for being on Unraveling Adoption.
All right. Thank you again, Beth. I appreciate the chance to tell my story.
Yeah. If people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way?
Probably the best way is through my website. It's www.frednicora.com. And there will be links on there. I also do have a gluten-free bread business, fredsbreadstore.com. And you can shoot me an email at fred@fredsbreadstore.com as well. So those are probably the two best ways. You can also follow me on Facebook. I post regularly on adoption issues, as well as other things that are just going on in my life. I'm just Fred Nicora. Not too many of us out there, so you should find me. Yeah. And I'm on Instagram as Fred Nicora as well.
Okay, great. I'll put all those links in the notes so it's easy to find you, especially if people aren't with a piece of paper right now. So go look in the show notes. And make sure and go find Unraveling Adoption too. While you're at it, go to our website, unravelingadoption.com. or find Unraveling Adoption on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. And if there are adoptive parents out there that are looking for support, I do have an adoptive parent support group called APtitude, and we dig into the tough stuff. We have a book club, a database, a private Facebook group, and monthly speaker series. So come and join us. That one's free, and we just invite you to communicate with other adoptive parents and work on this stuff together. So find all that on my website. And Fred and I want you all to stay safe.